welcome. Hi, my name is Alex Duman. I'm a fourth year PhD student at the University of California, Irvine. Today I'm going to talk to you about my poster, Landing on Compliant Surfaces, Lessons from an Animal Model of Landing Control. So here's just a general overview of my entire poster. You can find a PDF on that same link to take a closer look if you'd like. So let's jump right in. So for the background, terrestrial locomotion is really characterized by these high impact forces. So on the left, you're seeing a graph that I've taken from cane toads landing, and this is showing the magnitude of the ground reaction force through time. And on the right is similar work adapted from Hamil et al., and it's showing humans running at various speeds and their ground reaction forces. And in both cases, the animals and humans are achieving 3 times their body weight and ground reaction forces. And in addition to that, we know that the surface conditions really affect how humans and animals move. And so specifically compliance in the case of Ferris and Farley's work, which is shown in the left, there's the humans landing on compliant surfaces, and that changes the leg stiffness, which is that graph there in the middle. And then Monica Daly's group, her work has shown that same kind of trend and changes in leg stiffness in guinea fowl as a function of those surface conditions they're running over. So this brings me to my driving question, which is, does that landing substrate compliance really affect cane toads' coordinated landing? And so I'm specifically here looking at kinematics, kinetics, energy transfer, and the muscle activities. So what I've essentially done is created this setup, which you can see in the top right, where the toad is jumping off of a rigid surface and then landing on something that is potentially compliant. And so that platform can freely move vertically by a slide rail, and then I can additionally attach springs underneath that to achieve different compliances relative to that individual's body weight. In addition to that, I have a 6-axis force plate underneath that platform, so I can measure a 3-dimensional ground reaction force vector, which is shown there in blue. So basically what I've done is set up 4 different compliance treatments that I randomized in order so the toads don't know whether they're landing on something rigid or something that has some give to it. And so the rigid condition is 0 millimeters of displacement per body weight. I have 2.5, 5, and 10 millimeters of displacement per body weight. And just for reference, the average forelimb length is around 5 centimeters for a cane toad, so 10 millimeters is roughly 20% of their limb length. So it's a pretty significant chunk. I do have data from 2 different plate masses. So the first plate I used, or platform I used, was 725 grams, almost an order of magnitude larger than the toads. Today I'm going to focus in on the platform that was much smaller, 123 grams, more around the average size of the toad. I have data from up to 8 individuals. And then on that bottom right, you can see a diagram of the muscles of interest that I was looking at. Looked at pectoralis, deltoideus, both controlling shoulder motion, and coneus, which is an elbow extensor, and then palmaris longus, which is a wrist flexor. So here's just representative trace in that center panel. You see up at the top, I have pictures going from rest all the way to body contact because I'm really only interested in forelimb mediated deceleration. So those kind of key time points are pictured there, and the corresponding time in milliseconds is also listed on the bottom of each of those pictures. And then that first graph or panel below it, those lines are drawn down from each picture, kind of illustrating where that is. And those kind of blue or purple boxes in the center show where the forelimbs are actually in the air. And so that first plot up on the top is the limb extension ratio. And so you can see a little diagram off on the right there. As that increases or approaches 1, the forelimbs are becoming more extended, and as it approaches 0, they're becoming more flexed. So you can see how that changes through time. And then below that, those other 4 are the EMG, those electrical voltages for the muscles. So on the top, you have the deltoideus, pectoralis, and coneus, and then palmaris longus on the bottom throughout the entire hopping phase. And then we just focused in on the landing phase for the inverse dynamics calculation. So this is just from touchdown to when that body contacts or the hind limbs contact that surface. So only when the forelimbs are mediating deceleration. And so again, you can see the limb extension ratio up top. That middle graph is showing the components of the ground reaction force in blue, and then the platform displacement is actually given in orange. So you can see this is a compliance treatment of about 5 millimeters displacement per body weight. And then on the very bottom is the inverse dynamics of instantaneous power of each of those major forelimb joints, so the wrist, elbow, and shoulder, shown in green. So when we did the EMG, what we noticed is we looked at the intensities of all these muscles throughout the different phases of the hop or throughout the jump. And so this is just the data from the landing for those 4 representative muscles. And we see across those 3 compliance treatments we measured, it really doesn't differ. So the intensity or the amount of time that these muscles are spent turned on is not changing as a function of that surface compliance. And we see that across all the hopping phases. So really compliance isn't affecting how these muscles are being activated. Okay, so and then when we go to the kinetics, kinematics, and energetics, and see this is on the x-axis across those 4 compliance treatments we used in this case. And you see that on the rigid case, it's actually doing all the work. So 100% of the work is being done by the arms. And then as it becomes more compliant, the arms are doing a lower proportion of that work. And that makes sense because if you're landing on something that's rigid, your arms have to dissipate all that energy for you. Whereas if you're landing on something compliant, like a trampoline, you can deform that substrate and it can store or dissipate energy for you. And then to the right, in orange, you see the change in the limb extension ratio. So you can think about it as the forelimb compression through landing. And we see that that doesn't change at all significantly by those compliance treatments. So ultimately, the landing compliance does reduce the amount of work that the arms need to perform, but the kinematics are remaining largely similar across those compliance treatments. And then down at the very bottom graphs, you see the amount of work that the elbow is doing normalized to the amount of work that we calculated with inverse dynamics across the entire forelimb. So that's in that bottom left graph or panel C. And we see that actually the amount of work that the elbow is doing decreases as the surface gets more compliant. And what's interesting, the graph just to the right, at bottom right corner, is that same normalized work that the shoulder is doing relative to the total work of the arm. And we see that it's actually has the opposite trend where it's increasing the amount of work on those compliant surfaces. So we see that these proximal joints are really altering their work contributions when landing on compliant surfaces. So another interesting thing we noticed, and this is moving on to that next results column on the far right, is that we observe these different kind of landing behaviors. And the one on the left we're calling coordinated landing, where the individuals really use their forelimbs to kind of decelerate their center of mass before landing and allowing like their hind limbs to hit the ground, and they're not allowing their torso or upper chest or even head in some cases to crash or smash into the ground. And then as you'd guess on that right is a crash landing, which is where those individuals are allowing their torso or head to actually crash into the ground upon landing. And so what we kind of noticed were different trends in how these individuals were extending their limbs prior to contact or even after contact. So on the top left, you see the maximum limb extension ratio. So again, as it approaches 1, they're becoming more extended, and as it approaches 0, they're becoming more flexed. And so those individuals that are lower down and have warmer colors or red are potentially at greater risk, right, for being more flexed and potentially crashing. And the ones that are blue or cooler colors are more extended, so they're probably less likely to crash. And so those same 8 individuals in that top panel, if you translate those down, they're in the same colors and same orientation in that bottom graph, and that's actually showing the change in the limb extension ratio. So those ones that are coming in pretty flexed don't have a lot of ability to compress their forelimbs before they potentially crash into that substrate. And then on that top right panel, we have the 5 individuals we were able to get EMG traces off of. So what I'm showing is actually the limb extension ratio right at touchdown. And again, we see there is some variation within individuals. And then you can again translate that down to that bottom right panel. And that's actually showing you the proportion or probability that these individuals actually performed coordinated landings, which are in blue, or crash style landings, which are in red. So I have all their jumps categorized, whether they performed coordinated landings or crash style landings. And the total number of jumps I have from those samples are labeled in the bottom of each of those columns in white. So forelimb extension prior to touchdown really does seem to predict their landing behavior. And we do notice that individuals vary pretty significantly, in their crashing tolerances, which may suggest differences in their landing skill level. So another cool trend that we kind of noticed was that the vertical impulse actually correlates with the landing time, or the time at which they're landing over. And so in this figure, you can see that different individuals are like marked with different colors. So blue and yellow are different individuals. I think there's 5 on this graph that we show here. And then the symbols represent the type of landing behavior. So filled in circles represent coordinated landing behavior, and X's represent crash landings. And so if you notice, most of those X's are clumped down at the bottom left. And so what that means is there's not a long period of time that these individuals or crash style landings happen before the body or the hind limb or some other portion of the body contacts the surface or that landing surface. And in addition to that, they're not producing high vertical impulses, which makes sense because they're really like allowing their bodies to crash into the ground. But what we see is there's this really nice linear trend here. So what that suggests is that really these animals are applying a constant vertical force throughout the forelimb mediated landing, whether or not they're crashing or performing a coordinated landing. So it's really the initial conditions that they're setting with their forelimbs that predicts whether or not they're crashing. So the major takeaways of this work is that obviously the landing surface compliance minimally affected forelimb muscle activity. We also saw that the surface compliance reduced the energetic demands on the forelimbs. And then the reduced forelimb extension at touchdown is actually the predictor potentially of crashing. And then finally, cane toads don't seem to be relying on forelimb proprioception or like that feedback for coordinating their landings. So in my future work, what I'm hoping to do is actually look at whether or not they're using proprioceptive feedback from the hind limbs, like while they're taking off. So in this particular project, I've only ever had them jumping off of a rigid surface, and then it's the landing surface that can change in compliance or rigidity. So one kind of project that I've been working on recently is actually transecting a portion of the sciatic nerve, allowing it to reinnervate, and then seeing how that affects the cane toad's landing ability, because the myotatic or stretch reflex will not come back, and so they won't have that feedback during takeoff. And another simple way that I've also already collected data from is having them jump off of a surface that I can change the compliance of and land on something that's rigid and see if that affects their landing behavior. So with that, I'd like to thank you for sticking around and listening to my presentation. I'd also like to acknowledge both the Azizi and Daly Lab for all their support and work, and the American Society of Biomechanics for allowing me to present this work. So thank you. Please feel free to email me. We can set up a time to chat if you'd like to. And thanks for sticking around.